thank you so much for joining. I've been particularly looking forward to this panel for some time. It is always a pleasure to be in Estonia. And I think in the discussion of this topic, no better location for this conference or this discussion than Estonia, because as I often say to my American audience, Estonia is very much in the center of this, but also very much a leader in responding to the war in Ukraine and this new era of great power competition that we are in the middle of. I was writing a book about this for the last couple of years, and what struck me as I spoke to people, including the Prime Minister and others, about America's role in this conflict is that while I was doing research for the book until about a year ago or so, the concerns about America's role were private concerns. More recently, they've become quite public doubts. And for understandable reasons, we have an election coming up which will present a very real choice about America's role going forward in this. And given we have an historian on the panel, and I look forward to asking for his views on this, it's striking to me as well because I believe that this is a 1939 moment for my own country and for Europe. And there is a parallel to 1939 in that there was a similar split, division, debate in the US about America's role. And it was not preordained that the US took the path it did in 1939 and 1941, much as it is not preordained what path the US will take in this war, Ukraine, Russia, China. So that's where we find ourselves. And I think that this group is a perfect group to discuss. We have joining us from Ukraine, the Foreign Minister Kuleba, and given my concerns about technology...
He's there.
There he is. Okay, good. Mr. Foreign Minister, thanks so much for joining. I'm going to give you the opportunity to begin the discussion, given you are more central to this than anyone. First, I would ask if you can to give us a report from the battlefield, how significant this Russian advance is in the northeast and the east, and do you and Ukrainian commanders have concern that Russia could break through Ukrainian defensive lines?
Thank you for having, and first of all, I would like to apologize for not being with you in person. I sincerely appreciate the opportunity to join you online because I was once attending the Leonard Mary conference in Tallinn some years ago, and I promised that I will come again in person one day. Estonia is a country that proves to the whole world that a small country with a big heart can make a big difference. And it's a pattern, a paragon for everyone to follow. When it comes to the battlefield, it's tough. I will not be rosy in my. Russia is strong. We are suffering from delayed and insufficient supplies of military assistance, which we are forced to compensate with the heroism and sacrifice of our soldiers. So the main message remains the same: send us everything, because we have proven over these 2 years that when our soldiers have everything they need, we succeed. And when we don't have everything that we need, we don't. But what matters is the following. Some tend to draw conclusions that if Ukraine does not succeed on the battlefield, it means that the victory of Ukraine is impossible, and Ukraine must consider various alternative scenarios for the ending of this war. But this is a distorted logic, because as I said, when we have everything we need, we succeed. Instead of deliberating how else, what kind of concessions Ukraine should make in order to end the war, we want all officials and thinkers all over the world in respective capitals to ask themselves, what else can I do? What else should I send to Ukraine to win? I will not dwell on why Ukraine's victory matters. I think this is pretty obvious for not only for European security, but also for Euro-Atlantic security. So all we have to do is to follow the motto of your conference. Let us not despair, but act. Act what matters. And send us patriots, send us artillery ammunition, send us armored vehicles, allow us to hit any necessary military target inside of Russia, help us protect our skies, and you will see the difference. If you're not making all of this, do not complain on Ukraine. Of course, when I say you, I do not mean anyone in the press room, because all friends and are truly committed leaders and intellectuals. But I think all of us have to make this point in our conversations with those who still cast doubt in the possibility of Ukraine and all of us to succeed.
Mr. Foreign Minister, I was told by senior U.S. military officials in recent weeks and reported a couple of weeks ago that Russia saw the delay in U.S. military assistance as a window of opportunity to strike. And of course, we've seen these attacks since. Do you hold the U.S. responsible not just for the delay, but for giving, in effect, Russian forces an opportunity to take advantage of that delay?
I do not want to sound mean, not only with regard to the United States, but any other country that is helping us. Of course, all eyes are on the stage because they are the largest military assistance to Ukraine. But this is not the war that Ukraine and the United States can win alone. We will win if every country behaves like Estonia does. 1% GDP of Estonia was given to Ukraine to help Ukraine, and we wholeheartedly appreciate it. If every country in the world, and I can mention European nations as well, if they do more from what they are doing, the situation will be different on the battlefield. And they do not have an excuse. They cannot do it. They can't. The question is how to unlock this potential. So the short answer to a less diplomatic and shorter answer to your question is that I'm grateful to everyone, but I blame everyone who is not doing enough.
Prime Minister Kallas, because the subject of this panel is about America's role not just in the Ukraine war, but in effect in European security, and given that we have an election in the fall where the two choices have quite a different view of this, what is the plan B for Estonia and NATO without clear U.S. leadership in NATO? Now, the scenarios include a U.S. withdrawal from NATO, although Congress has acted to make that more difficult. But in effect, a U.S. president could decide not to order troops to defend a NATO ally, etc. So does NATO have a plan B?
The problem with plan Bs is that if you start to work on plan B, then you forget about plan A, and I think that is not the right way to do it. What the Foreign Minister Kuleba said is that we have to support Ukraine not only as long as it takes, but as much as it is necessary, so that they can win. And of course, everybody has a role in that. So the price goes up with every hesitation, with every delay. That is so very clear. For us, at least, it's so very clear. What comes to the American elections, then of course, we have to work with every leader, elected leader of our allies. It's not up to us to choose the leaders of a different country. But what we can, I think, also in Europe do is not so much talk about whose election victory we are hoping, or whose election victory we are afraid of, but to actually, focus on what we can do in the meantime. And that has been already for years. We have to do more for our own defense. And We have to spend more on our defense, and we also have to all help Ukraine as much as it is really necessary for them to win. Now, we have made our Minister of Defense has made the calculations that if everybody would commit 0.25% of their GDP as military aid to Ukraine, then it would be enough for Ukraine to win. And to all of those leaders who are saying that or not saying so directly, it's never that, but the public opinion is like, we have given a lot to Ukraine already, but 0.25%, 99.75% still remains for your domestic issues. So I think it's not the big sacrifice. Ukrainians are fighting on the battlefield. They are losing lives. They are losing soldiers. The only thing that is asked for us is reallocation of resources, and that is not much, I think.
But let me ask you, because one thing the U.S. delay in aid showed was that Europe can support more, as it did, including Estonia, but not fill the gap that the U.S. represents. The U.S. is just too big. And that, as much as Europe did to send weapons and its empty its ammunition stocks and allocate money, it could not fill what the U.S. can fill. And the same is true of the broader role of the U.S. in a NATO security environment. So my question is, you can increase, but you can't replace. So what's the solution?
Well, that is so very true. We can't, U.S. is the biggest ally in NATO, and we can't replace U.S. I think what we have to do is to convince also Americans who are skeptical of supporting Ukraine or supporting European defense, and really trying to convince them economically. I mean, 48 states out of 50 states, the main investment partner, the main trading partner is Europe. American companies are earning 2.7 times more profit from Europe that they are earning from Asia, the whole of Asia, not China, but the whole of Asia. And also like over 60% of American investments go to Europe, and it's vice versa. So it is, jobs in America. It is also having an effect on America if something goes wrong in Europe. So it is also in the interest of United States to be present to support the peace in Europe.
And listen, I remember I met with you months ago in Washington, and you told me you believed that Speaker Johnson would come around.
Yes,
and he did. So you're one for one on that. I will give you credit. I'm conscious of our connection, so I'm going to take advantage of the the foreign minister, before I go to the other panelists. But I wonder, do you, Mr. Foreign Minister, if this is the last major U.S. aid package for Ukraine, it's possible, I'm not saying it is, but if it is the last, do you have a plan B?
We don't, I fully agree with the Prime Minister. I have been making the same point for months. If you have plan B, you will end up with plan B. Even with this supplemental that was passed recently, we were told many, many times in between last December and this April, give up, happy, forget about the supplemental. It's not going to happen. But we said, no, we will work on what is the best to our country. We have had enough of plan Bs in our history. All of these plan Bs, mostly, by the way, advised by our partners to us, they ended up in Ukrainian. So I understand the risk you're pointing to, but we will work hard on plan A, which is the continuation of support and ramping up support to make Ukraine win.
Timothy Snyder, I truly enjoyed your lecture yesterday. I learned a lot, including that the orcs from J.R.R. Tolkien were borrowed from previous Scandinavian tales. I did not know that. you talk about Ukraine's central place in the history of, in effect, great power competition going back centuries. Well, more recently, USSR, Nazi Germany, but even back to the Polish Empire, the Russian Empire. I just wonder, given Ukraine is central again to this conflict, does history point to great power war? Is it inevitable, in effect?
So thanks for the question. I want to stress, because it hasn't been stressed, why Ukraine is central now. I mean, I think everybody here knows, but I'm just going to assume, for the record, that it's worth saying that the war in Ukraine is central not just because it's holding back a genocide in Ukraine. It's central because it's teaching a lesson about empire in a part of the world where empire is still alive. It's central because Ukrainians are reminding us that there is international law, and sometimes international law has to be defended. It's central because they're fulfilling the entire NATO mission, even though their economy is 1/250th of the size of the NATO economies. I would repeat Prime Minister Kallas's point that what we really should be measuring is the size of what we are giving to Ukraine. And when Americans talk about, as we like to, about GDP per capita and defense spending, what we should really be talking about is what's the percentage that we're giving to Ukraine. I think that's the honest measure, because Ukraine is actually fighting the war that NATO was planned to fight. And so if we're serious, then Americans should be asking themselves, okay, why are we being outspent by basically every single European country on this? And Ukraine, of course, is also important because the Ukraine is keeping us in this world where there's not a war with China. Ukraine is keeping us in a world where there's not nuclear proliferation. If we let the Ukrainians lose, we lose all of those things. So, Jim, you said that we're about to be in 1939. I'm going to agree with you in a certain way. My comparison would be 1938. This is 1938, but Czechoslovakia has chosen to fight. Czechoslovakia has chosen to fight. So you have an imperfect democracy. It's the furthest democracy east in Europe. It's not perfect. It has various problems. But when threatened by a larger neighbor, it chooses to resist. In that world where Czechoslovakia resists, there's no Second World War. The Czechs had a good army. They could have held the Germans back. It was largely a bluff on the German side. If the Czechs resist, then the French and the British and maybe the Americans eventually start to help. There would have been a conflict, but there wouldn't have been a Second World War. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, it was invading Poland with the Czech armaments industry, which was the best in the world. It was invading with Slovak soldiers. It was invading from a geographical position that it only gained because it had destroyed Czechoslovakia. So if the Ukrainians give up, or if we give up Ukraine, then it's a different Russia making war in the future. It's a Russia making war with Ukrainian technology, Ukrainian soldiers, from a different geographical position. Then we're in 1939. We're in 1938 now. In effect, what the Ukrainians are letting us do is they're letting us extend 1938. They're helping us to stay out of 1939. So my answer is no, it's not inevitable. The Ukrainians are giving us this chance, and we have to take this chance if we want to prevent a great power war.
Samir, I'm coming to you, I promise. I am going to start with Minister Hasani only because on topic, I want to ask you, if I can, a similar question that I asked Prime Minister Kallas. Can Europe fill the gap in U.S. leadership if it were to go away, or if it were to decline, shrink, become less reliable?
I strongly believe the United States will not leave Europe. I strongly believe the United States will continue to be the guarantors of peace and security in our continent, as they were in the two major conflicts that we have seen, the First and the Second World War, and also what has happened at the end of the Cold War. I strongly believe that whatever the political discussions are right now, we will continue to have our American friends and allies heavily involved in what is happening. And this is because we fight for the same values, we fight for the same principles, and the United States, whoever is in power, will continue to do so. Now, as the Prime Minister said, and as my friend Dmytro was echoing, there is no plan B if we don't stick to plan A. And let's continue to engage with our American friends and allies. Let's continue to deliver better messaging, as the Prime Minister was saying. Let's continue to explain better, also to the domestic policy, in order to achieve the results that we expect. There are mechanisms that are slow. There is cynicism in similar rooms, but the battlegrounds need more and more results, and those results are visible.
Is that hope or a plan?
It's a reality. Mm-hmm. It's a reality. We have the engagement of the US, constant engagement of the US, and the continuous engagement of the US. Now, expectations are different, but we have to continue delivering, and we have to continue engaging, and we have to continue giving what capabilities we have to Ukraine in order to achieve victory.
So, Samir, you know the framing of this conflict from those on this panel and many in this room. That it is a rules-based international order. It's a free world versus those in Russia and China who want to tear that down or replace it. Does India have a side in this conflict?
Look, I was very scared coming into this room because this is a room of believers and I'm the only one who's an atheist. So it is difficult for me, so be kind to me. Let me just try and respond to two parts of your question. Does India have a side? I'm sure India has a side, but I don't speak for India. I speak for myself here. And I'll give you one Indian view, and we are 1.4 billion, so there are many views. And we change our minds every evening, so there are many more. So this morning, this is my view. My view is that after what I've heard, I think this is not a moment of reckoning of any great world war. I think many such conflicts have been resolved in the past when nuclear powers have had to face defeat when they have invaded certain countries. America has that experience. China has that experience with Vietnam. Pakistan, a nuclear power always ready to go to war with India, had to leave the Kargil heights after occupying them, and they were beaten back through conventional action. And I think provided you can get your supply chains and provided what the minister was seeking from Ukraine can be delivered at scale and at speed, this is not a moment of reckoning where the world has to face any great moment of truth. I think this is a military response that could be resolved in the battlefields of Ukraine, provided the rest of you are willing to participate. I think what you have done well till now is host conferences supporting Ukraine. You've done nothing more. So you've done very well in creating chat shops that talk up your support to Ukraine. But when it comes to real action, you've seen that the Russian 2.0, which is when Russia reorganized its operations in Ukraine after its initial setback, they have been grinding forward. And the creeping expansion of Russia in the battlefield is visible. And I do not believe that a $40 trillion opposition is playing to wait in dealing with the $2 trillion military giant in the battlefield. And that's a aseptic observation from someone sitting very far away, not involved. One side is not participating in the battlefield. And that's the reality. There is only one actor who has reorganized his strategic engagement. And I think you guys really need to think. And why I'm saying it is because if something like this was to happen in the Indo-Pacific, it tells countries like us that you have no chance against the Chinese. If you guys can't manage a $2 trillion economy in a battlefield, you have no chance against the Chinese. Don't think you're defending China. You are encouraging China by everything you do here. The Chinese are taking hope by your dismal and abysmal performance facing a much smaller adversary. You cannot even... anyways, sorry. I don't want to go. You're nice people. You're my host. Now, so that's the first observation.
No,
the second observation.
Make sure you're looking at the American when you say that, because the Estonians are doing well.
Look on the Americans. Please don't play this Trump bogey. It is the Biden administration that has failed to deliver everything that minister has been asking from Ukraine. So let's not play the Trump bogey. Let's talk about now. The fact is that you will be dealing with the same American state, irrespective of who's sitting in the White House, and you will have to deal with the same defense establishment that will be making the decisions. The president goes and gives airwaves and gets retweets. That's it. Everyone else decides. And that's the way America is structured. And so don't play the Trump bogey here. It's America that you deal with, irrespective of who's sitting in the White House. And let's be honest here. Now, on the India stand, look, it's a very difficult situation for most Indians. And I think all of you here should understand this. When we were threatened, when the 7th Fleet was sent to the Bay of Bengal to intervene in a conflict that involved our territory, it was USSR that stood in the way. when resolutions were passed in the United Nations, many of them sponsored by those who sit in this continent, it was Soviet Union that vetoed them. You must understand that it has been the longest standing partner of India. That is not going to take that away. Ukraine has only now, and let me congratulate the minister. I had dinner with him in Delhi a couple of weeks ago. And Ukraine has only now begun to realize that it needs a fresh new engagement with India. It had forgotten us after USSR. And it was only Russia that took forward that partnership and became the heir of that relationship that we had with the USSR. So, the fact is that we have a long-standing history with Russia, and many of the countries in this continent that are participating against Russia and who talk about colonialism and imperialism. By the way, we're in India. We were a colony. So we understand the Estonians well, because in some sense there is an empathy here. What you feel towards the Russians, we feel towards many of your allies in Europe. And you're asking us to defend and stand with them. So in some sense, it's a complex arena, Jim. It's not that easy for us but my position, territorial integrity and sovereignty have to be respected. They must be the only mantra. All of us in the last 75 years have been too lazy in defending these. We've been too lazy. We need to go back not to 1938, we need to go back to 1945. And we need to understand the sanctity of boundaries, the sanctity of sovereignty, the sanctity of territoriality. In this world where we could change regimes through digital activism or through, we have become too loose in understanding why regimes matter, why political systems are important, and why borders are relevant for people. We need to start respecting that more. I hope Europe can sort this problem out soon, because it also hurts the rest of the world. The rest of the world does not read it like you are reading it. By the way, it was if you're sitting in Cape Town, the conversation is very different. Yeah. If you're sitting in New Delhi, the conversation is very different. The problems and the causes and the consequences are also assessed very differently. Sure. Russia is not the villain everywhere. Many believe that it was provoked into doing something that it has done. I don't want to go into the merits of what Russia did, but let me just say this. The rational view from Delhi is that Russia is a deep, trusted friend. Russia is wrong in invading Ukraine. And there are no two ways about it.
If you believe territorial integrity is a central issue, you have two powers here in Russia and China who are far from committed to that idea.
Absolutely.
So doesn't that make India's side in this conflict clear? How can you be for protecting sovereignty and territorial integrity if you are friends with a country that just invaded Europe's largest country, and another one which has, it annexed the South China Sea and has designs on Taiwan? How can you hold those two positions consistently?
Jim, we run an annual foreign policy poll at ORF, the institution I work in. And every year we have young people between 18 and 35. Thousands of them respond to that poll. This year, when we asked them who are India's two most trusted partners, number one, the US, number two, Russia. Who are the two countries who have complete disregard for territorial integrity? Number one, US, number two, Russia. So my problem is that everyone we love believes that entering other countries and eliminating people they don't like and changing regimes is breakfast. So my problem is that big powers that we are friends with, big countries generally tend to become friends with big powers. They have shown scant respect since 1945, and that's why I said 1945. Most recently, if you look at the early decades of this century, who was the one who was violating territory? And what were the Europeans doing when those territories were being violated?
Well, listen, I would argue there's a difference between annexation and regime change, but it's a subject for another debate.
Sitting in a country for 20 years is not regime change. Sitting in a country for 20 years is not regime change. It is annexation. So my point here is, look, we can question the basis of India's relationships with many countries, including with the Brits, who are not on this panel, so I'll leave them for now. But look, that's not the point here. The point here is that if we are truly honest, all of us have violated many covenants that allow the rules-based order. In fact, the crowds that shout the loudest for rules-based order today are also the same voices that demand the weakening of sovereignty and nationhood. Rules-based order is based on the respect for that concept of nations that we decided in 1945.
Prime Minister Kallas, I mean, it's essentially a whataboutism argument, and I wonder what your response is. Do you believe there's an equivalency between, for instance, U.S. actions in Vietnam, Iraq, etc.? I mean, and I don't want to like go through that old history, but the point is, does that undermine the framing of this as you have the free world, the defenders of a rules-based international order that is fighting not just a values-based battle right now, but one that is in the interests of a more peaceful world that has survived in the 80 years since World War II, etc., largely? What's your response to that framing?
I mean, I was listening very carefully, and I think we have a common position, which is you are anti-colonialism and we are anti-colonialism. So are I think everybody who is also supporting Ukraine in this war, because Russia is the last colonial power in the world. They are trying to colonize Ukraine very openly. So when we talk to the global South, this is what we are addressing, and it is true what you are saying, that Russia has presented them that we are not colonizing power to African countries, and like you say, the Soviet Union was their friend, but actually they haven't seen that that was empire colonizing other nations. So I think this is what we have to focus on. What we have in common and what is the common language. So 45, that was true. United Nations was created and the United Nations Charter, which is a very good document. But what is lacking there is the sanctions part, the accountability. What happens if somebody breaches the UN Charter? And every time there is in the history, but I'm of course with my favorite historian here, so I don't want to go to that territory because he knows this much better. But I'm a lawyer by profession, so I'm really interested in the international law. And if you think, United Nations was created because of the big world crisis, which was the Second World War. I also feel that there is this moment in time right now to develop the international law further, and that is having a very clear set of rules for accountability, because that would actually be beneficial for the world peace, that the people who are thinking aggressors or would-be aggressors are really thinking that there is a price that they are going to pay if they are taking up these steps to invade another country.
Jim, can I have a 30-second?
You can, before I go back to Ukraine.
I think when someone poses a question to the dominant powers of the last 100 years, it is not whataboutery. It is level playing field. What you demand from us should be seen through your actions. So whataboutery is when the Americans ask that question. When an Indian asks an American that question, it is not whataboutery. It is reminding them that we are doing as you do, not as you say. So I think that's whataboutery should be carefully used. Second, I agree with you, Prime Minister. In fact, I would suggest that next year, your institution and us, we should talk about World Order 2.0 with the reforms of the UN. When a P5 member violates the covenant of the Charter, what should be the accountability mechanism? P5 have got away scot-free for whatever they have done in the past. And this is again that similar situation where the veto is enabling and Jim, I'm not calling it rightful action. Violation of international law is being permitted to the Russians because they wield that veto in the Security Council. Had it been any other country, you would have had a UN action against them. But because you have a P5 member using it, they are being able to engage in international criminality because of that protection, like many other P5 members have done and continue to do.
Well, and I will note, the view you give is not entirely... The global South doesn't have a monopoly on it. It's a debate that we're having in my own country now in this presidential election. I mean, one of the candidates, Trump, has expressed views quite similar at times to what you said. If we can go back to Kyiv, the foreign minister, I always say in situations like this, ask the Ukrainians or ask the Estonians. When you're talking about sovereignty and how they see the threat to their own sovereignty, how they see the conflict, a lot of folks will impose their views from the outside. So let's ask the Ukrainians, who is on the right side? in turn, not just the war in Ukraine, I know what you feel about that, but in a defenders of the rules-based international order as it stands, versus those who say it was imperfect, needs to be replaced, and that, by the way, the U.S. and its partners have often violated it just as much as they claim China and Russia are doing now?
You see, in the last 2 years, I visited many countries in Africa, South America. I spoke to them, and I witnessed an enormous amount of intellectual stretching, trying to reconcile respect for rules and appreciation for the Soviet Union or for Russia or whatever. The problem is that the problem that all of these commentators are facing is very simple. Even if Soviet Union once saved your life, does it allow Russia to kill someone else in front of your eyes, with you compassionately explaining that killing is a bad thing, but actually many others kill someone else, so this particular person can also another person. All beautiful, intellectually perfect, and entertaining conversations end up when you boil it down to a very simple point. Where do you stand when you see someone being killed? And all our big conversations about order, new world order, international law, UN Charter, this can continue endlessly, and we can drown each other in historical arguments. And I can give a lecture about Ukrainian-Indian relations and how great they were, and that the city of Kharkiv that is being razed to the ground these days by Russian bombs used to be the capital of the Indian community in Ukraine. And every year we celebrated the Hindu festival in Kharkiv, and it's gone. I can mention that when I was by a dog, it was a doctor of Indian origin working in a hospital in Kiev who gave me the first care. And it doesn't to India. I mean, I can stories with regard to any country. This is not about big things. This is not about big intellectual discussions. We can all be everyone present at this panel are at intellectual debates. The point is, how do you act seeing when someone is trying to kill someone else in front of your eyes? Answer, and everything else will be set in order.
Professor Snyder, does history support the framing as this being, well, supporters of a rules-based international order and those who are against? Or, as you listen to Samir, does history support the view that, well, that's imagined, and in reality, that world is just our or the free world's kind of imagery as opposed to reality?
I mean, I love the idea that I can speak for history. I can't
more than me.
I can't even speak for the United States, which is a wonderful thing because it's going to allow me to say some of the things that I'm about to say. It's what history shows is that principles matter when people care about them, invest in them, take risks for them, and build institutions around them. And I certainly agree with the Prime Minister, and I think with both of you, that this is a moment, more than other moments, when one can choose to invest personally, institutionally, financially in principles and the laws around principles. But what history does show, additionally to that, is that the people who come and support principles aren't the same thing as state actors. So here there's going to be a little bit of a line of dissent from what Samir said. So the idea that, for example, Americans are, the United States is hypocritical, yeah, by all means. But the idea that that means that all Americans are hypocritical or that all administrations are the same doesn't follow, right? So there are plenty of Americans who think that invading Iraq was a violation of the international order. And by the same logic, think that invading Ukraine is a violation. There are plenty of people who think that, and in my view, they're right. And I'm one of them. I oppose the Iraq War for some of the same reasons I oppose the invasion of Ukraine. And it's the people around the principles and the politicians and the institutions around the principles that one has to support, I think, rather than saying some countries are always hypocritical and therefore we're going to dismiss those countries, right? And then the other thing history teaches, which I think is apropos, is that agents change. So we take it for granted now that India is an agent, right? India is a very important agent in history. It would be ridiculous for me to say that, we're not going to listen to India because it's only existed since 1948. And I think something similar has to be said about the way that Ukraine is often dealt with, right? So Ukraine has a very, very long history in various ways. It's existed as an independent state several times along the way since 1991 in the present case. But one thing I think, I've been involved in some of these conversations with, with folks in Latin America and in other parts of the world. And I think it's very important if you're from Latin America or Africa or Asia to recognize that Ukraine has been around since 1991, and it's your responsibility to know that. It's not okay to say, Dmytro Kuleba has to come to us and explain that they exist, right? Because at that point, you're flipping into becoming the imperial power and saying, well, it's okay for us not to know that these small countries exist. It's their job to run some kind of advertising campaign and come to us. Because at that point, you're saying, we're the big important power. Who the hell knew Ukraine existed? It's their job to come explain themselves to us. And likewise, with confusing Russia and the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union hasn't existed since 1991. Present day Russia is a fascist regime. The idea that we're going to confuse that with what the Soviet Union did in the 1970s when they vetoed something. That's not Ukraine's job to explain. If you're India, if you're a big power like India, it's your responsibility to know that sort of thing. So if we're going to have principles, we have to take the agents seriously. And this business of not knowing the difference between Russia and the Soviet Union, or saying that Ukraine has to come and it's their job to come and explain that they exist, you can't apply principles if you don't recognize the agents who are involved. So that would be the other point. And it's a historical point because the Ukrainian history is, and I think I'm echoing both of you now, it's part of the largest theme in history, I think, in the 21st century, which is the post-imperial theme. How do we get past the history of empire, which is a problem for everybody, and first of all, the United States. How do we get past the history of empire? But we can't get past the history of empire if we don't recognize one another as subjects. And part of the problem with Ukraine is that it's not recognized as a subject. And I do think it's the responsibility of agents also in the so-called global South to say, okay, we're going to recognize Ukraine as an agent rather than saying, well, 50 years ago or 70 years ago.
Minister Hasani, from even before the first Russian tanks came across the border in Ukraine, well, it's not the first, right, because it goes back to 2014, but in 2022, lawmakers in the U.S., military officials made a connection between Ukraine and Taiwan, that China was watching Russia's experience there to inform its own decisions about Taiwan and elsewhere in the region. The other point I've heard consistently, and I've heard it expressed here, I might even say that it's a prevailing view, is that Russia's experience in Ukraine is already a strategic failure, that is therefore a deterrent to China and Taiwan. But I wonder if you agree that it's been a strategic failure. It seems that Putin is calculating that he has the upper hand now. He's just been inaugurated for his 27th term as president. I've lost count at this point. Perhaps preparing for another partial mobilization. Is it a strategic defeat, or is it quite an open question? And might you even say that today, at least, Russia is regaining the upper hand in Ukraine?
There is one element that has made us all think since 2014 and maybe before that Mr. Putin looks at himself in the mirror and decides in the morning. Meanwhile, for us, democratic countries in Europe and elsewhere, we need certain steps to start deciding and making the necessary moves. And that involves parliaments, governments, and the international organizations where we sit. But we have an opponent that decides alone and has a mechanism behind himself that acts accordingly. And this is the reality that we have been facing since the war in Georgia in 2008. And everything has been going on like this. We have an imperialist Russia that wants to claim back what it wants to. And this imperialist Russia does not represent the same values that we others have. Therefore, we have this kind of discussion. We have these question marks. Samir, my dear friend, very wisely puts different perspectives, but we have an authoritarian regime that doesn't believe in the values that we are building up, does not share the same thoughts, and does not foresee itself into the same future. Multilateralism is suffering, and it's not suffering today. It's suffering for decades. We look and think of the same facts from opposing angles, not from different, but from real opposing angles. And we see black where some people see white, and the other way around. I come from a post-colonial country where Albania has been a colony of several empires, but ironically enough, we have always been under the influence of the Russian dream of the expansion towards the Mediterranean. And we have suffered also that, not only during the communist times, but long before. And what has happened is that the configuration of the values is so opposing that brings many difficulties that we have to tackle only if we are united in our configurations. Now, going back to your question, we should define victory. If those temporary territorial gains that Russia has achieved so far are considered victory, I don't believe that. I see a more unified international community in opposing what Russia is doing. I see a strong position supporting Ukraine, supporting the territorial integrity of a country that has been invaded. I see more and more support and more unity on denouncing the violation of human rights of the Ukrainian people and elsewhere. And this is something that will bring more and more impetus to support the fight of the Ukrainians. Look at NATO and look at the discussions that NATO had before and after the invasion. Look at the configuration of the alliance before and after the invasion. Look at the numbers and the countries that are willing to join before and after the election. Look at the positions, also those countries that consider themselves neutral before the invasion, and how they see now neutrality in the new realities. It might be a small victory for the Putin's regime, but I don't think it's a victory for the Russian people. It's not a victory for the Russian people to be seen as aggressors, as pillagers, as rapers, as sadic individuals that kill and destroy everything that they have in front of them. This is not what we believe that the human being should continue to be. And I'm pretty sure that this is not the end. It's only the beginning of the change.
No, but that's why I think it's important that Russia is losing this war, because, like Timothy Snyder has said, in order for a country to become better, it has to lose its last colonial war. They haven't lost their last colonial war, and for them, I mean, they are not seeing that, aggressors, rapers, killers, but expanding the empire, it's glory, and that's why, as long as it is glory, then the war is glory, then you will always have people, it's not this leader, it's going to be next leader, because if people admire dictators, there's no obstacle in becoming one or submitting to one. And that's why, you have to have this, bigger understanding, that Russia will lose this war, and then it will be beneficial to the society as well, because for a small country like ours, war always means devastation, human suffering, atrocities, whereas for a big country it might also mean new territories, new resources, and all the good things that come out of it for those for their understanding. So I think this is important to understand and to also base our strategy on.
And I also enjoy the exercise of the lessons from history. Are we in 1938? Are we in 1939? Are we in 1945? But I would echo what the Prime Minister said. We need to have. We are on the position that we have Russia on the glory path, and we have to think of how to build up a structure that would make everything accountable. And let's think of a new 1945 where the defeating powers realized what they did and realized what the crimes they created.
In a moment, I want to go to a question as to whether there are parallels to 1962 in terms of the possibility of nuclear escalation. Before I go back to Kyiv, Samir, you said you had a brief thought.
On the question of the assessment of where we are in terms of winning, losing, responding, challenging, I think if you are truly fair, 2.5, 27 months after it all began, or 28 months after it all began, it would be safe to say that there is one country that's really suffered, and that's Ukraine and its people, without doubt. And we must stop that, and we must do everything. And that's why I said in my very beginning, in my first comments, that if a $40 trillion coalition is not supplying enough and fast enough for battlefield victories, then there's something for the 40 billion to think about. It's not India's problem.
Wouldn't it be easier if India...
But let me
just a moment, to your point. Wouldn't it be easier to challenge that if India was not buying
I'm coming to your question.
Russian fossil fuels?
The second, Russian fossil fuel was an American deal. I hope you heard your American ambassador explain at the CFR 3 days ago, saying that America wanted certain countries to procure Russian oil so that the price would be maintained. So again, let's be honest here. Your cars are fueled by oils refined in many other parts of the world, and let us not apportion blame to the last mile of the supply chain that you built. But that's not the point here. My point here is, if you're fair, the 40 billion is not kicking in to handle a 2 trillion. That's the reality, that people are suffering, and Minister from Ukraine is right. It's Ukraine which is bearing the brunt of all sort of politics that is being played outside Ukraine in different capitals of the world, including yours and mine. So that's the first part. Second, the only winner of this particular conflict as it stands today is one country. If you had asked China 3 years ago, what would you want the outcome of the war to be? They would have feared two outcomes. They would have feared a decisive Russian victory. It would have jeopardized their plans in Central Asia and Greater Eurasia, and Russia would be back. And they would have feared a Russian defeat. It would have, in many ways, strengthened the world rules-based order, American-led rules-based order. They would have feared both of them. A prolonged conflict only enables one person in the house to become more influential in the days ahead. It's neither good for us in India, nor good for others anywhere else in the world, that person is going to have the veto on the future of the order that emerges. So your original question, do we fear the continuation of this war? Yes, we do, because the wrong party wins.
Mr. Foreign Minister, in terms of the West's and the U.S.'s response to the Russian invasion, has the U.S. overestimated the risk of escalation to the point of limiting its options and, in effect, empowering Putin?
It did, and it continues to do so. And while it's easier for us to engage in a discussion on the consistency of the policy of the countries, of non-Western countries, I think it should be also fair to say that if the West stopped looking at Ukraine through the lenses of Russia, things would have been different.
Tell me how.
There would be all the decisions would be made faster. These decisions would be bigger. Less people would be thinking about life with Russia after the war ends, and the escalation would have been considered differently. Not a single argument of escalation proved to be right in the last 2 years. Do not provide Ukraine with artillery, it will result in escalation. Do not provide Ukraine with HIMARS, will be escalation. Do not give Ukraine German tanks, it will be escalation. Do not give Ukraine planes, it will be escalation. None of this proved right. 2 years of someone sitting in the offices in Berlin, Paris, Washington, other capitals, and thinking and the risk of escalation, we were losing time, lives, and our economy. And I've been very open about that with all of my partners. They know that I'm very straight on this, because in the end, what we're talking here is the survival, physical survival of Ukraine. If anyone thinks that that if hypothetically Putin wins in Ukraine, he will keep the Ukrainian flag, will allow everyone to speak Ukrainian, and let us live our lives. These people forgot Bucha, Mariupol, Irpin, and other places. Not to mention deeper historical examples, which I'm sure Professor Snyder will be very eloquent about. This is a genocidal war without an exaggeration. Ukrainian nation will cease to exist if it loses. And if partners do not stand by Ukraine under these circumstances, resolved to ensure Ukraine's victory, then we will cease to exist. And they will write books and speeches about lessons learned. That may be a satisfactory outcome for some of our partners, but this is something that I have no intention to let happen. And I apologize for being so frank. I don't want to sound ungrateful, but this is the motivation behind my argument.
Please.
I want to build on that. What is keeping the West from supporting Ukraine as much as it needed, and that is what Foreign Minister referred to. It's the fear, fear of escalation, fear from the nukes. Fear really for the Russian defeat. I've heard that a lot, and if you think about NATO's enlargement, all these events in history, then this continues all the time. That what happens if at that time 1990s, what happens if Soviet Union collapses? This is a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. Russia's defeat is not a bad thing, because then there could be really a change in the society, and there are many different nations right now part of Russia as well. I think if you would have more like small nations, it's not a bad thing if the big power is actually much smaller. So and also fear from elections, because we are all democratic countries. This means that you constantly have to keep up what the public is thinking, and of course you need leadership as well to say what is right and what is wrong and what we have to do. But it's clear that you will have the voices that why you don't you just finish this war and we all continue with business as usual? I think this is also understandable. So I think we have to recognize the fears that are keeping us back from supporting Ukraine. And I also agree with the foreign minister that the problem is that the West has been looking at Ukraine, but also at us through Russian lens. I said this 2 days ago, and I'm really, really glad to see that Minister Kuleba is also seeing this. And that is a problematic part, because these are the Russian narratives about Ukraine, about us, about Russia as well, that the West has bought. But it's time to really open the eyes. It's not the way it is.
You know, it's interesting. You don't even have to go back to the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was only last year where there was a lot of hand-wringing about, well, if Russia loses in this Ukrainian counteroffensive too much, it'll be too damaging for Russia. We have to figure out a way to kind of soften the blow, etc. I mean, that's this time last year, actually less than a year ago, and of course the circumstances have changed. I'm going to go to our venerable audience in just a moment. I did want to ask a question, though, about nuclear escalation specifically. I reported on this about how in 2022 there was great concern that Russia might use a tactical nuke there. And I know that the U.S. was quite concerned about it, as I understand it, as were its Indian and Chinese counterparts, although there were some in Europe who thought that was an exaggerated threat. Timothy Snyder, if I could ask you, are the ingredients, just bigger picture here, coming together for nuclear conflict, but also nuclear proliferation, that countries, for instance, U.S. allies that become doubtful about the U.S. nuclear umbrella, South Korea, Japan, look at the experience of Ukraine, look at a U.S. president who might pull back and say, I need to go nuclear. You have similar pressures in the Middle East. And by the way, you have Ukraine, who had nuclear weapons and no longer, and it gets invaded. Are the ingredients there for a more nuclear world where nuclear conflict is more likely?
Yes. I mean, I feel like you started asking one question and then we ended up on another one. So I just, on the war, I think the presence of nuclear blackmail, although it's meant to make us fearful, is actually reassuring in terms of nuclear use, because nuclear blackmail is no longer a strategy if you actually use the device, right? And so I think the fact that Russia continues to blackmail us with its nuclear weapons is a sign that it's not actually meaning to use them. And of course, the last 70 years show that you can have, the point's already been made, powers with nuclear weapons, including the United States, lose wars all the time. It's completely routine. And since 1945, the colonial power has usually lost wars, conventional wars. So I want to connect to the point about principles again, because fear and principles don't work well together. And the best way to make there are many ways to make Americans be unprincipled. I mean, it's a long list, but one of the ways to make Americans unprincipled is to get them to think about themselves and how it's all about them, right? Which we are very good at. And what Russia has done during this war, Jim, is that it's triggered that, because as soon as the word nuclear is in the conversation, then Americans think, oh, well, this is somehow about us, because maybe they're talking about an intercontinental nuclear exchange. And so then it becomes about us, and then we get to be afraid. And then we get to hesitate, and then we don't mobilize that economic advantage, which we objectively have. On the big picture, I agree with the premise of the question very much. I think if we're concerned about the chances of nuclear war overall, what we should be concerned about is nuclear proliferation. And Russian actions in Ukraine in this century have been unfortunately directed towards a more nuclear world, because Ukraine is not only a country without nuclear weapons, it's one of the very few countries that have given up nuclear weapons. And it's the only country which gave up nuclear weapons in a kind of ceremonial public way in exchange for assurances from countries, including the Russian Federation at the time. And so by invading Ukraine in 2014, and then again in 2022, what Russia has done has been to demonstrate that, well, actually, you ought to have a nuclear weapon because that's the only way to deter a nuclear armed power. And I think this is now very much in play. So if Ukraine wins this war, which again I would stress would be the historically normal thing to happen, because the anti-colonial power since 1945 usually does win, and the Ukrainians are backed up by what should be a very powerful coalition. If Ukraine does win this war, then we will be so to speak, in a normal situation where a nuclear power has lost a conventional war. But if Russia wins a war against a country which ceremonially gave up its nuclear weapons, and it also wins a war while using nuclear blackmail, which isn't that normal. Well, so there's two public things, right? Yeah. Ukraine publicly gave up its nuclear weapons, and Russia publicly talks about it has nuclear weapons. Those are the things which make this unusual, right? And it's an especially kind of extreme example. So if Russia wins this war, then I think we are in the world that you describe, where both American allies on this continent will build nuclear weapons. American allies not on this continent will build nuclear weapons. And countries that are not American allies not on this continent will build nuclear weapons. And so I think the overall risk of nuclear war goes up quite a lot if Ukraine is allowed to lose.
You were right. I was asking two questions, and you answered two questions.
No, here we are.
Like any good reporter, I sneak them in. All right, two questions from the audience, and I will do me a favor, if you can, brief questions, and we'll get as many answers as possible, beginning here in the front, and then I'll move around.
We've got to be really careful about talking about 1945 as the year when everything was great. It was great for some countries. It wasn't so great in Ukraine, Poland, or the Baltic states.
A question or no?
No, that was a comment.
Okay. Fair comment, but please questions in the back.
Thank you. Benjamin Tallis, German Council on Foreign Relations. Samir Saran, thank you very much for raising some uncomfortable truths, some good points, but I'd like to draw out a couple of the false equivalences that you made or reported. First, in terms of colonial powers, despite the delusions that some Brits still have, Britain today is not comparable to Russia. So saying that you get on with our former colonial power, we get on with your former colonial power, Russia, I don't think stands up as an argument to be made. Second, violations of international law committed by the West. Yes, they have caused great harm, and we have to pay attention to the effects that they have had in causing that harm and in undermining our confidence in ourselves and our transformative power. But we have to pay attention to the intent as well. And there is no way that spreading democracy, however misguidedly, can be compared to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and a genocidal imperial war, as Timothy Snyder has rightly called it. And I think it's extremely important, because if we let those false equivalences go unchallenged, we would indeed despair but not act. So I'd like to hear from the panel how they would take that forward, actually, how they would deal with those criticisms and say, no, we're doing something different. Here it is, and here's how it's going to be better.
Okay.
Thank you.
Who'd like to answer, including you, Mr. Foreign Minister? Would you like to?
Actually, can you ask everyone who wants to give Samir Saran a response first? There might be quite a few. I'm just kidding. Thank you.
If you'd like to begin, you're welcome to.
No, look, listen, I'm not, I don't know where you understood or where you did not get my first input in this entire conversation. Please go and win this damn war. And you are the ones who are not doing enough to win it. And the historian here has also told you that there are enough evidence from history that these wars are generally lost by colonial nuclear powers. So obviously, if this is not going to be the case here, you have let Ukraine down, and it's the coalition that has not worked. Don't blame India and India's assessment of it. So please go and fight that war. Number two, I think one thing that you could be doing is perhaps having a little more color in this room. That could be one good way of talking to people from countries who have a different assessment of the world. So next time, let's have a Leonard Mary conference which has 50% from the global south, because they constitute 80% of humanity, for example. That could be one way of doing it. Right? So I think instead of believing that someone should somehow, through just having a UD cologne that comes from France, believe what France believes of the world, it's not going to happen. You have to also, like you said, you mentioned about the agent and agency. We are not going to come and get educated by coming to your doorstep and learning about your view of the world. Perhaps you have to come to us as well and talk to us in a different tone than you did in the 19th and 20th century. So maybe that conversation needs to happen. And please come. I believe you me. There are many in my part of the world who genuinely believe in what I've just said, that this is a false and wrong and criminal illegal invasion of Ukraine.
Okay.
And the world must mobilize in favor of Ukraine to restore its territory.
Mr. Foreign Minister, did you want to respond?
To what exactly?
Well, to the question. The question was arguing these are false equivalencies.
About colonialism.
Well, comparing, in effect, arguing that that the slate for the West is not so clean on these questions of colonial actions, etc.
Well, listen. I think the only the fundamental essential difference between distinguished Samir and me is that I know history of India better than he knows history of Ukraine. Because if he did, he would realize that everything Russia was doing in Ukraine, essentially for 300 years, was a practice of colonialism. And I have as many reasons to complain on the West as any country in the world. I can mention that it was President Clinton and President Yeltsin who conspired behind Ukraine's back to strip Ukraine of nuclear weapons. And where we are here now. And this war would not start if Ukraine was a nuclear power. And now we spend months and years asking, begging, working hard to make our partners deliver 7 Patriot batteries to Ukraine to defend us from air assaults from Russia. You asked the question about nuclear weapons. Let me give you one number. Between January and April this year, Russia dropped 9 kilotons of explosive in missiles and artillery on Ukraine. The bomb that fell on Hiroshima was worth 15 kilotons. So who is talking about nuclear? Who has the right to talk about the risk of nuclear escalation for us? 3 months, and we will get the same amount of destruction as in Hiroshima. So instead, again, guys, I sincerely appreciate all the intellectual comparisons, uncomfortable truth, eye-opening parallels. Let's make things work. History will judge everyone else. And I don't want this debate to look as if all of us are debating with Samir. He's a great expert. But if we were discussing a war between India and its larger neighbor, I think we would have heard some different speaking points.
Gentlemen, and then we'll come forward, but there was a gentleman in the back I think might already have the microphone, if his hand's still up, or maybe, there he is. My apologies.
Steve Erlanger, New York Times. Thanks very, very much. I'd like, if with permission, to drag us back to the topic of the panel, which is defining as long as it takes, and get away from the other argument. We have a NATO summit coming up, which will be in part circling around this very question, what to provide Ukraine to give it hope in the longer term for the future. So what I'd like to ask the panel is, what should be the NATO military spending goal that comes out of this summit? Should it be 3%? Do you think you can get agreement on 3%? Should it be 4%? What do you think is required if the Americans reduce their support? What is required from Europe as a contribution of military spending so Ukraine has what it takes for as long as it takes. Thank you very much.
Perhaps you, Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, if you both.
It would be a good start if everybody does the 2%, because this year 18 countries will reach 2% out of 32. So that would be a great start. But of course, we have to aim higher. That is also very true. But the question is, what is realistic? And I'm just, bringing this example. We are spending 3.2% on defense. That has required us to raise taxes. I can tell you it is not popular. It is not popular, and all the parties who said during the election that we have to spend at least 3% for defense are not supporting the raise of taxes. I'm only one soldier on the battlefield in this regard, and this is hard. It's very, very hard. So this. We are democratic countries, and saying that it's 4%, 5%. It is, of course, it is necessary in times where we are right now. But I want to emphasize it's not slogans, it's real money. And we don't have, any other money than taxpayers' money. And taxpayers need to understand why we have to do this. And they need to be part of this. And I also understand why it is much harder for other leaders to explain this back home if it is already difficult for us here.
And exactly as the Prime Minister was explaining, reaching the 2% is the ultimate goal that we are expecting to reach the NATO summit. But at the same time, there is this internal debate that we have in our societies. We're talking about 32 democratic societies, 32 people that elect and choose their own governments. We're not talking about authoritarian regimes that decide to wage wars and spend on military budgets whatever resources they have. How difficult can be to explain to the people that some of the money that should go to build bridges or schools or hospitals should be spent on military equipment? And this is an eternal discussion that we have to continue explain to our people. And the existential threat that we're having at our borders is a threat that is mobilizing, and it is becoming more and more existential. And this is the result that there is a consensual agreement at NATO that we have to spend more. But this was not the case 10 years ago. And the Prime Minister should remember, and many colleagues here remember that when before the situation erupted so violently in 2014 at NATO, we had different discussions with regards to the budget. Now, do we need to spend more tanks or on social security? And these are the debates that, in a way or another, have diminished, and there is a general consensus in at least in the parts of the world where I'm coming from, that we have not only to spend more, but to spend on helping, supporting Ukraine, increasing our collective defense, and prepare for futures that are unknown with threats at our border that are coming from one authoritarian regime that doesn't seem to become more democratic than it was before.
No. And, Professor, you said you had a quick thought.
Just briefly, it would make me very happy if at the NATO summit was introduced the figure of percentage of GDP spent to help Ukraine in this war, because I think the percentage of GDP spent on defense in general is a much more abstract measure than the percent of GDP spent on Ukraine in this war, and that the two are also connected in a different way. Investing in Ukraine winning now it means not having to spend more on defense in the future. So if one is truly concerned about overspending in the future, the best thing to do is to direct the money now where it will actually make a difference. So I would really like to see a NATO summit where Americans had to face up to how little they're spending in terms of GDP for Ukraine, and where other countries got more credit.
Yeah, no question. And if you look at the graphs, Estonia is frequently at the top. Please, here. And just as short. We have, 3 minutes, 55 seconds.
Thank you very much. I would like to point Olena Halushko, International Center for Ukrainian Victory. Why NATO allies aren't implementing the most cost-effective solution?
It's a fair question. Would you like to direct it to
the NATO partners?
Okay.
Well, in NATO we have 32 countries, and we in Estonia try to do our share. I mean, we are spending 1.3 or 1.5% of our GDP on Ukrainian aid. so far we have spent that. And protecting. I mean, I agree with you. It would be cheaper to defend and protect Ukraine than to give money later on to all rebuild this. And also Russia knows very well migration is the vulnerability of European Union, Europe. So what is he doing? He's creating the migration pressure, not only from Ukraine, but also bombing Syria years back, Africa, Wagner soldiers. All the migrants come to Europe, and Europe can't cope with that. So it is something that we have to keep in mind. And what I also explained to our southern colleagues that are much further from the war, and it is also, if your worry is migration, you have to help Ukraine right now.
And you could make the same argument, I think, about strategic objectives, smaller investment now to help neutralize the Russian threat to Europe. We have a minute, so I'd ask for the briefest question. If you say who you'd like to direct it to, if you have someone in mind.
Yeah, to anyone who wants to answer it, actually. Okay. Nigel Gould-Davis from the IISS. Maybe Prime Minister Kallas, you said we only have our own money. That's almost true. There are $300 billion of Russian state assets being frozen at Western financial systems. Legal scholars have found a legitimate path for taking it. Back to 1938-39, Montagu Norman, the then chairman of the Bank of England, facilitated the transfer of Czechoslovak gold to Germany, the then and future aggressor, on the grounds that this was required for international monetary order. History damns that decision. Surely it would damn a decision not to take the assets of the aggressor.
Okay, question?
Yeah. No, the asset, we have been advocating for using the frozen assets. And as a lawyer, we have, our parliament just adopted the law. And basically, it's very easy. I mean, Ukraine has a legitimate claim towards Russia regarding the damages that they are causing. Russia has a legitimate claim towards us because we have frozen the assets. So we are not confiscating them, but we are recognizing the claim. But we are making the settlement of those claims so that after we have, used this for Ukraine, then, the leftovers could go back to Russia if everything is settled, what I doubt. But I see that not all allies are there yet with this. And I'm trying to convince them that, you will also at one point come to a point where, your taxpayers are asking, why should we pay for the damages that we haven't caused? And that is a very legitimate question. And that's why, and also the second point is, can you possibly imagine that there's a decision to just unfreeze the assets? After all that they have done, not so we need the the strategy also for that, and that is easy because we have something. We have a saying in Estonian which is hard to translate into English, which is that better to have okay, I will not go. I can't translate that anyhow. But I'm saying that as a lawyer, I'm always in a stronger position when I already have something that I don't give out. Then it's the opposite. And actually, that is our strength, that we have the assets and all the arguments, can be disputed what they are saying, that why can't we use these assets? But the work is ongoing, trying to convince the others as well.
We're over time. If I gave the Ukrainian foreign minister a final word, would that upset my organizers? It's okay. The Foreign Minister Kuleba, before we go, a final thought to the question. Do you have confidence in the statement as long as it takes?
No, I will be very quick. I want everyone to forget the words that became the slogan for supporting Ukraine, which is we'll support Ukraine as long as it takes, and focus on one thing, on one slogan. We will support Ukraine as long as it takes Ukraine to win. If that happens, if that becomes the cornerstone of things will be different. You will see difference on the battleground, and you will protect your prosperity and your security in the long run by doing so. Thank you very much for this excellent conversation. I did not regret a single minute of my working Saturday. Thank you.
And we're glad it was not interrupted by air raid sirens, which would be real. Thanks very much to the Foreign Minister and to all present.